Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for family, warmth, and joy. I had come to expect the usual scene every year. My parents in the kitchen, the smell of turkey and stuffing wafting through the air, the sound of football blaring on the TV in the background, and the crackle of the fireplace. We were never the perfect family, but it was always comfortable. And that comfort, I had learned over the years, was enough. I leaned back in my chair, trying to enjoy the moment. At 30, I had worked hard to get to where I was. A steady job as an office manager at a local tech company, a modest but cozy apartment in the city, and a sense of independence that came from having my own life. A life that was mine, and mine alone. The only thing missing was love, but that seemed less important to me these days. David, my older brother, was a different story. The firstborn, the one everyone expected to succeed. He always had big dreams but struggled to make them come true. His latest attempt was a failed business venture that had left him deep in debt. I hadn't heard much from him lately. He wasn't one to reach out unless things were going well. I assumed he was busy, trying to figure out his next big move. But when he walked through the door that evening, I could tell something was different. He looked beaten. My parents, sitting at the table, exchanged looks, but said nothing. It wasn't until the meal was halfway through that I got the shock of my life. My mother cleared her throat, wiping a stray tear from her eye. She wasn't the emotional type, so I knew something serious was coming. I glanced over at Dad, who had his usual stoic expression, but even he looked uneasy. I turned back to my plate, unsure of what was about to unfold. "Brian," my mother began softly, "there's something we need to tell you." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I knew from the tone of her voice that this wasn't the typical "we have to talk" conversation. My heart began to race. I set the fork down and looked at her, waiting. "David." She paused as if the next words were too painful to say. "David's in trouble. Big trouble." I looked over at David, sitting across the table, his eyes avoiding mine. His face was pale, and I could tell he had been holding something back. The tension in the room was suffocating. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, my voice betraying the concern that had suddenly gripped me. "He's in debt," Dad said finally, his voice more strained than I'd ever heard it. "A massive amount of debt. He's lost everything, his savings, his investments. He's bankrupt." David winced at the word bankrupt, but said nothing. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. My brother, David, always had big ideas, but I never imagined it would come to this. I glanced at my parents, who were now both visibly upset. "Who's going to help him?" I asked, knowing that no amount of talking or wishing would make his problems go away. David was always in over his head, always thinking he could be the next big thing. But that's the problem with dreams. Sometimes they crash and burn. "We've thought about that," Mom continued, her voice shaky. "And there's one person who can help him. Mary." I blinked, not sure I heard her correctly. "Mary?" I asked, furrowing my brow. "Yes," she said, her eyes now focused on David. "Mary Hughes. You know her. She's a financial mogul. Very powerful, very successful. If anyone can save David now, it's her." I sat up straighter. Mary Hughes. The name struck me like a bolt of lightning. She was a legend in the city's financial world, a powerhouse in the finance industry. I knew of her, of course. Everyone did. But I never imagined she'd be tied to my family. I was skeptical. "What makes you think she'd help David?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "She doesn't even know him." "She does now," Dad said, his voice more confident than before. "David has a plan. He's been in touch with her. They've had some meetings." "Wait," I interrupted, confused. "David, you've been meeting with her behind our backs?" My eyes shot to him, furious at the idea that he had kept this secret from us. He met my gaze but said nothing. Finally, he spoke up, his voice quiet. I didn't want to worry you. Worry me? I stood up abruptly, the anger rising in my chest. You've been digging yourself into a deeper hole, and now you're telling me you've been talking to Mary Hughes. This isn't a game, David. You've put everyone in jeopardy. My parents exchanged glances, their faces tight with worry. I turned to them, feeling my frustration building. And what do you expect me to do about it? Brian, my mother said softly, her voice pleading. We need your help. We need you to go with David to Mary and convince her to help him. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You want me to go and beg for help from Mary Hughes? Yes, Dad said. You have a way with people, Brian. You're good with negotiations. We think she'll listen to you. My mind was racing. This was insane. How could I be the one to fix David's mess? And even if I agreed, how could I possibly convince someone as powerful as Mary Hughes to help us? She wasn't some benevolent philanthropist. She was a businesswoman. And I knew her reputation well enough to understand that she didn't give out favors easily. But as I looked at my parents, their faces etched with worry, their future hanging in the balance, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't turn my back on them, not now. I'll go, I said quietly, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. I'll go with David. David looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But it didn't make me feel better. I still had no idea what I was walking into. What would I say to Mary Hughes? What would David say? And even if we did get her to help, what was the cost? I had no answers, but one thing was for sure. Thanksgiving had just become the most difficult day of my life. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the weight of what was ahead. The holiday I had been looking forward to was now clouded by uncertainty and fear. But I knew this was just the beginning. What I didn't know yet was how much further down this rabbit hole I was about to go. The real story was just beginning. The drive to Mary's office felt like a lifetime. I kept staring out the window, the city skyline reflecting my inner turmoil. The truck's engine hummed in the background, but I could barely hear it over the pounding of my own heart. David was sitting beside me, his hands gripping the wheel with a force that seemed to match the tension in the air. This wasn't just about the loan anymore. It was about everything. The guilt, the shame, the sinking feeling that somehow, no matter what we did, nothing would ever fix what had been broken. Do you think she'll really help? I asked, hoping David would throw me a lifeline, something to ease the suffocating sense of dread I was feeling. He was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the road as we navigated through the city's busy streets. There was no reassurance from him, just a heavy silence. Finally, he answered, but it wasn't the kind of answer I was hoping for. I don't know, but we don't have a choice, Brian. We've got to try, he said, his voice rough, like he knew the truth but didn't want to admit it. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach only grew tighter. For years, I'd done everything I could to keep my family intact, to protect us from the fallout of David's mistakes. But this was different. This was the kind of mess that no amount of effort could fix, no matter how hard we tried. We were about to face the reality of everything we'd avoided for so long. As we neared the towering glass building where Mary's office was located, I felt my stomach drop. The sleek, modern architecture of the building seemed to mock me, reminding me just how far removed our lives had become from this world. Mary Hughes was a powerhouse, a woman who controlled millions of dollars, and here I was, sitting next to my reckless brother, about to beg her for a lifeline. The thought was absurd. David parked the truck in the underground garage, and we walked through the polished, sterile lobby of the building. The smooth, white marble floors seemed to echo my every step as I tried to focus on the task ahead. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept returning to the impossible situation we were in. There was no going back now. When we reached the 30th floor, I felt the weight of the moment settling in. David knocked on the door to Mary's office, and a few moments later, we were ushered inside. Mary was sitting behind a massive desk, her expression unreadable as she looked up at us. The room was minimalist: stark white walls, sleek furniture, and the subtle scent of expensive perfume hanging in the air. It felt like a world I didn't belong to, a world where money and power were the only things that mattered. But as I stood there, trying to gather my thoughts, one thing was clear: we needed Mary's help. "Good to meet you both," Mary said, her voice smooth and controlled, almost rehearsed. "I assume we're here to discuss your brother's situation." David didn't waste any time. He jumped straight into the pitch, his words rapid and desperate. "Yes, we, really need your help. My business has collapsed, and there's no way out. I've made some poor decisions, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right." He glanced at me for reassurance, but I couldn't bring myself to give it. This wasn't about me. It was about David. I stood there in silence, trying to steady my breathing. This was supposed to be simple. We'd beg Mary for help, she'd see the desperation in our eyes, and she'd offer us a lifeline. But the words that came out of David's mouth next changed everything. "I've been thinking, Mary," David said, leaning forward in his chair, a look of determination on his face. "I'll make it worth your while. You help me with the loan, and in return, Brian here will do whatever you want." I froze. My stomach turned, and my pulse spiked. What? What do you mean?" I asked, my voice unsteady. David didn't answer me directly. Instead, he looked at Mary, a sly grin forming on his lips. I'm sure Mary would like a bit of entertainment in exchange for her generosity. "Brian here could be of some use to you. Get close, flirt a little, whatever it takes. I know you like a good-looking guy. Brian will do the rest, and we won't have to pay the loan back." My head was spinning. Was he serious? Did he actually think I would go along with this, sell myself out to save his reckless skin? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I opened my mouth to protest, but nothing came out. David had just proposed that I flirt with Mary, manipulate her into giving us money. The thought of it made me sick. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "I won't do that, David. You're out of your mind." David's eyes hardened. He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "What the hell is wrong with you? You've got no problem making sacrifices for the family, but when it actually counts, you back out?" I stood up too, my hands shaking with anger. "I won't be your pawn," I said, my voice low but steady. "This is wrong. I'm not doing it. You can't force me into this." Before I could say another word, Mary stood up from her desk, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Enough," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I don't need this. I've heard enough." David opened his mouth, but Mary held up a hand, silencing him. "You both need to leave. This conversation is over." I couldn't believe what had just happened. As we turned to leave, I could feel the anger boiling up inside me, but I held it in. This wasn't just about saving David anymore. This was about something bigger, my own dignity, my own self-respect. And that was something I wasn't willing to compromise on. As we walked back to the truck, David was fuming, muttering under his breath. "You've ruined everything, Brian," he spat. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We had both just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And as I got in the truck and slammed the door, I realized that this was the end of the road for me and my family. There was no going back from this. The drive home was silent, and when I finally walked through the front door, I was met with the angry faces of my parents. They were furious with me for not going along with David's plan. But as their words washed over me, I realized that this wasn't my battle to fight anymore. My family was broken, and I couldn't fix it. Not anymore. I wasn't going to beg for their approval. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into sacrificing my dignity for David's mistakes. I had made my choice, and in that moment, I knew it was the right one. As I left the house that night, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free from the expectations, free from the chaos, and free from the people who had always tried to control me. The world was mine to shape, and I was done letting others define who I was. The events that unfolded after that day were like a whirlwind, and it was hard to keep track of who I was anymore. The moment I pulled that little girl out of the street, saving her from a speeding car, felt like the turning point. Her large, innocent eyes stared up at me as I pulled her to safety, barely aware of the chaos that had almost transpired. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had something bigger in store for me. I didn't know it at the time, but that little girl was Mary's daughter, a fact that would change the course of my life in ways I never imagined. It was a late afternoon when I received a call from Mary. I had just finished a meeting with a potential client for my business, a meeting that had gone surprisingly well. But the truth was, I didn't feel like celebrating. My mind kept replaying the confrontation with my family, their anger, their disappointment in me. How had everything spiraled so quickly? Was I wrong to stand up for myself? My thoughts were cut off when the phone rang. "Brian," Mary's voice came through the phone, smooth and controlled, but with an underlying tone of gratitude. "I want to thank you for what you did today. You saved my daughter's life. No one's ever done anything like that for me, and I can't let that go unacknowledged." I felt my heart skip a beat. The events of that afternoon had been a blur, and it took me a second to remember which child she was talking about. Then it hit me. The little girl I had pulled to safety was Mary's daughter. "Of course," I said, trying to mask the surprise in my voice. I was just doing what anyone would have done, but Mary wasn't finished. "I don't think you understand the weight of what you did. My daughter means everything to me. You've done something most people wouldn't even think to do. I want to repay you. I'm going to invest in your business. I see potential in you, Brian. Your drive, your vision. I believe in it." I sat back in my chair, stunned. I could feel the weight of her words, the sincerity in her tone. Mary Hughes was not someone who threw around compliments lightly. Her words had power. Her actions carried weight. This was more than just a token gesture. This was a life-altering opportunity. I don't know what to say," I managed to stammer. "Thank you. I never expected anything like this." "There's no need for thanks," she said, her voice soft but determined. "You've earned it. I'll have my team reach out to you to get things set up. Just know that I'm backing you, Brian. Now it's your turn to make it count." After the call ended, I sat there in silence, letting the weight of the situation sink in. My head was spinning. My life, which had felt like it was falling apart just a few days ago, was suddenly moving in a completely different direction. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of possibility. With Mary's investment, everything started to change. My business, which had been treading water for months, suddenly found new momentum. We secured new clients, the revenue began to flow, and soon I was hiring a few more employees to keep up with demand. But despite the success, something felt off. As much as I had worked hard to get here, I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was going to come back into the picture. And sure enough, they did. It started with a visit to my office one morning. My parents, David, and even my cousin Mark, who had once told me he was too busy to help, walked into my conference room without warning. I had just sat down to a meeting with a potential investor, but seeing my family there, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. "What are you doing here?" I asked, standing up, my voice tight with frustration. "Brian, we need to talk," my mother said, her voice soft but tinged with urgency. "Not now," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "I'm in the middle of something important. You shouldn't be here." But David wasn't about to let it slide. He stepped forward, his eyes dark with a mixture of desperation and guilt. "You think this is all because of some business meeting, don't you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mary's been helping you, hasn't she? We know she's interested in you. All the money you've suddenly got, it's because she wants you." I felt my stomach twist. David's words were like a slap in the face. "What the hell are you talking about?" I shot back, trying to keep my composure. "She's investing in your business because she's got a thing for you, Brian," he continued, looking pleased with himself. "We've been keeping an eye on you, and we know how these things go. You can't fool us. You've played the game, and now you're reaping the rewards." My father chimed in, his voice low and serious. "It's time for us to get our share. You don't need to keep everything to yourself. Mary's got money, and we've all seen how she looks at you. You think we can't see that?" I shook my head in disbelief. You don't get it. This isn't about some stupid romantic game. I've worked hard for this. Mary helped me, yes, but she's been nothing but professional, and that's it." But they wouldn't listen. The accusations kept coming. They believed Mary was interested in me, not because of my skills or my potential, but because I had somehow manipulated her into giving me money. It didn't matter that my business was thriving on its own. To them, it was just a means to an end. And now, they wanted in. "You're going to go to her," my father said, "and you're going to get her to give us money. We need it, Brian, and if you don't, well, we'll just have to go to her ourselves." The tone of his voice made it clear this wasn't a request. They were demanding that I get Mary to help them, to bail them out. And in that moment, I realized just how far I'd fallen. My family, the people I had tried so desperately to help, had become nothing more than parasites. "I'm not doing this," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You can't use me to get what you want. I'm not playing this game anymore." As I turned away from them, I knew that there was no turning back. My family had pushed me to the edge, and I had finally found the strength to step away. They were too far gone, too consumed by their greed and jealousy to understand what true success was. But even as I walked away from them, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mary had been right. My actions, my choices, had led me to this point. And now, with my business and my life on the line, it was up to me to make it count, and I was going to make sure it did. I had never felt so alone, and yet, for the first time, I felt free. The weight that had been suffocating me for so long was slowly lifting, as though a storm was finally subsiding, leaving only clarity behind. It had been months since that fateful encounter with my family at Mary's office. The chaos, the accusations, the guilt that had been eating away at me, all of it seemed so distant now. And as I sat in my small apartment that night, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that I had been holding on to the wrong things for far too long. The day my family came to Mary's company was one I would never forget. I had known they would eventually come looking for money, but I never imagined how far they would go. Their desperation to feed off my success, to make me the bridge between them and the wealth they thought they deserved, left me in utter disbelief. I had tried to help them. I had sacrificed so much for them. Yet when the chips were down, it wasn't love or loyalty that they sought. It was money. It was always money. When we arrived at Mary's office that day, I felt the tension in the air. My family stormed in like a pack of vultures, eyes darting around the office, looking for any sign of weakness. They thought they could manipulate Mary the way they had manipulated me. But what they didn't realize was that Mary wasn't like me. She wasn't naive. She wasn't blind to their greed. And what really surprised me was how she handled them. Calm, collected, and unwavering, she sat them down and listened to their demands. But when she finally spoke, her voice was firm, almost cold. "I don't owe you anything," she told them. "You may think that because I've helped Brian, you're entitled to my wealth. But you're not. You won't get a penny from me." I could see my family's faces fall. My father's face turned red with anger. David stood there dumbfounded, while my mother looked at Mary with a sense of disbelief. They had never been told no. They had never faced someone who wouldn't bow to their will. But Mary didn't stop there. She turned to my family and added, "And if you think you can intimidate me or manipulate me, you're sorely mistaken. I've worked too hard to build my empire to let people like you take advantage of it." The silence in the room was deafening. It was the first time I had seen my family so humbled, so vulnerable. And that's when I realized just how much power I had been giving them all these years. Power that wasn't mine to give. My family didn't leave quietly. They stormed out of the office, cursing and muttering under their breath, leaving behind a trail of resentment and bitterness. But what hurt the most wasn't the words they hurled at me. It was the truth that I had been living in a lie. They didn't care about me. They cared about what I could do for them. The moment I stopped being useful, I was discarded. They had always used me as a tool to get what they wanted. But Mary, as unexpected as it was, had shown me a different path. When I turned to her after my family left, she didn't judge me. She didn't blame me for what had happened. She simply looked at me with understanding in her eyes and said, "You don't have to carry their burden, Brian. You've done enough." I had always thought that success meant pleasing everyone, being the hero in every story. But the truth was, success meant taking control of my own narrative, without letting anyone else write it for me. And for the first time, I was starting to understand that. Over the next few months, things slowly started to fall into place. I invested the money from Mary wisely and turned my business around. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but every day I felt stronger. I no longer felt the pressure to appease my family, to play the role of the martyr. My business grew, and with it, my confidence. But the most important change wasn't in my business, it was in me. I had learned to say no. I had learned to value myself more than the approval of others. And while I had to distance myself from my family to achieve that, I knew it was the right choice. As for my family, they continued to spiral into chaos. David's debt, which had been the catalyst for everything, only grew worse. My parents, consumed by their greed and shame, refused to accept responsibility for their actions. They tried to find someone else to blame for their misfortune, but the truth was too glaring to ignore. They were the architects of their own downfall. When I heard about their financial ruin, how they were forced to sell their house and move into a tiny, run-down apartment, I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for them. I had tried to help them, but they had refused to change. And now, they were reaping what they had sown. I often think back to that Thanksgiving day when everything started. I remember how my parents had sat me down, telling me how David's mistakes were the family's problem, and how I needed to fix it. They had looked at me like I was the answer to all their problems. But the truth is, I was never meant to be their savior. I was meant to save myself. The story ends with me standing in my new office, looking out the window at the city below. I had worked hard to get here, and I had earned every bit of it. But the journey hadn't been easy. I had to make tough choices, and those choices had cost me my family. But I didn't regret it. Sometimes, I muttered to myself, the best way to move forward is to walk away from the people who are holding you back. And as I took my seat behind my desk, I felt at peace for the first time in years. I had reclaimed my life. I had taken back my narrative. And that was more valuable than any business deal, any amount of money. The lessons I had learned were clear. True success comes from integrity, from standing up for yourself and your values. And the most important lesson of all, you don't owe anyone your success, your happiness, or your peace.